So, how did I get here? That's the question I'm going to be looking at today. This is a vocation story, but if you think you've heard my story before, I just want to say that this one's going to be a little bit different. Because I'm specifically looking at the question of how did the kid that everybody thought would be a scientist go on to study for the priesthood as an adult? I was thinking about this a couple years ago when I spent some time in Georgia and encountered a good number of alligators. I mean, coming face to face with such an efficient predator might make anybody rethink their life choices, but I was reflecting on this because alligators have a pretty specific significance for me. And from a certain perspective, my story begins with alligators. As the son of a veterinarian, we had a lot of picture books about animals in my house. And I remember clearly as a young child, I don't remember how young, but pretty young, I was flipping through one of these picture books about alligators. And I came to one of the most important realizations of my life. I was sitting there, and it occurred to me, I want to know everything. I was so fascinated by the natural world flipping through this book. It just occurred to me, I want to know everything. I want to just dive into as much knowledge as I possibly can. And so when I got into school, I met a friend of mine, somebody who would become a good friend, who was a bit of a budding scientist himself. So he taught me about this thing called science, where you could do basically just that. And so I was hooked right away. You know, I started going to the library and reading science books in my free time, the ones with lots of pictures, of course. I would read about stuff like microbiology and volcanoes and the life cycle of stars. I'm about 7 at this point, by the way. So imagine how excited I was when I finally got to take like an actual science lab in school. And imagine my disappointment when I found out what science labs actually are. They were measuring bean plants. Think about the most lame thing that you could do in the name of science. I mean, they weren't even like mutant bean plants or anything. They were just regular old beans. So that was thoroughly disappointing. And let's say I was at this time I was pretty disappointed with my religious education as well. I hated going to mass. Just couldn't stand it. Thought it was boring and pointless. Just get together and sing a bunch of dumb songs. But there was one response I was very enthusiastic about. Whenever we got to the end, the priest said, the mass is ended. The mass is ended, go in peace. Yes! It had its high points as well. And like with CCD class, that wasn't terrible, because it was kind of like school, but I found out that the difference is, in CCD class, you could just draw stuff in the margins of your workbooks, and the teachers couldn't do anything about it. So it was in the context of one of these CCD classes. I was preparing for my first communion, and I was hard at work in the middle of a Spider-Man fight scene or something. And I remember something caught my attention. The teacher said the word transubstantiation. It's like, oh, well, it actually sounds a little interesting for us. Sounds kind of sciencey. I'll take a break from the Spider-Man for a couple minutes. And she was saying all this stuff about, like, during the Mass, turning bread into God. And which to me sounded kind of like magical powers, so I was obviously interested. And she kept repeating, this is something that only a priest could do. And she emphasized that very strongly. Like, I can't do it, your parents can't do it, not even the principal can do it, only the priest. I'm like, not even the principal, this is a big deal. So I was trying to wrap my mind around that, how only like the specific type of person could do this thing. How is that possible? I'm thinking to myself, it must be that the priest like knows the magic words and nobody else does. I'm thinking, like, if I can get close enough to him during Mass, and I can hear the stuff he says really quietly, I'd be able to do it too. Now, my imagination was a lot bigger than my nerve at this age, so I never actually put that to the test. But this was an event that would leave a bigger impact on me than I realized at the time. Going forward from this, you know, I started doing the math eventually, and I started thinking to myself that, well, you know, the things that have an impact on eternity, like forever and ever, are probably the most important, so I guess I better actually start caring about this church stuff. So I started trying to pay attention at Mass, and I wore a scapular so I wouldn't go to hell. But my heart wasn't really in it. Like, I liked the attention. I kind of did like the attention that I got from people who told me my necklace was on backwards. But other than that, I didn't. My heart wasn't in it. I still didn't like the church thing very much. Still found it pretty boring. And so it was a series of small events over time that sort of like started to turn this around. I remember being in science class. Once science class actually started to get interesting, we were talking about genetics, and the teacher told me about Gregor Mendel, the founder of modern genetics, who also happened to be a Catholic friar. So they're like, what, really? So he was like a monk? She's like, yeah, I mean, basically. How do you do it? How do you discover genetics in a monastery? By measuring bean plants. You gotta be kidding me. It was through a lot of these moments of sort of like rethinking everything that I thought I knew about both science and faith. Gregor Mendel wasn't the only one. I learned about Georges Lemaitre, the Belgian scientist who discovered the Big Bang model of the universe, was actually a Catholic priest. And one of the most important ones, not from a Catholic perspective, was that the reality that our world originated from a single eternal being was discovered by Aristotle, a pagan philosopher and scientist who had no vested interest in our religion, who came before Christ. It was stuff like this that motivated me to dive deeper, and so I started learning more, even more confusing stuff. I would watch, this is fourth grade at this point, I would watch like Nova episodes on string theory and that sort of thing. And now, as a fourth grader, I didn't understand most of this, but that was a really important turning point for me, because I realized that I could enjoy and like assent to this stuff even without understanding it. There's a quote that I find pretty foundational from the famous astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson. He said once in a podcast I listened to that just because you can't wrap your mind around something doesn't mean it isn't true. The example that he gave was light being both a particle and a wave. Really hard to wrap your mind around, but the science checks out, so it must be true. And the funny thing is, because I'm pretty sure Dr. Tyson's an atheist, but this understanding that just because I can't wrap my mind around something doesn't mean it's not true is actually fundamental in motivating me to dive deeper into the realities of my faith. So it's not just these fundamental realities about the spiritual world that fascinated me, but also about sin and grace and the reality that everything that we do, for good or for bad, affects the people around us. And so it was through this process of like diving deeper into these deep spiritual realities that I began to appreciate the Mass more. I began to see the sacraments as sort of a map that allows us to see these things we can't see otherwise. Just like a map of the world lets us see things that are too big for our eyes to see. The sacraments are sort of a map that allows us to see these spiritual realities we wouldn't see otherwise. I don't want you to think I just sort of like thought my way into liking Catholicism, because it was really the witness of other people that solidified this for me. My parents started taking me more retreats and summer camps and that sort of thing, and seeing people coming to Mass who were actually happy to be there and weren't just checking a box so they wouldn't go to hell like I was doing. That was actually what that provided the sort of rhetorical force that actually made me realize like this is something really important and this is where the truth is. And so it was during one of these summer camp masses. I remember this all kind of coming together. There was a priest up by the altar giving a sort of vocations pitch. I don't remember exactly what he said, but for some reason in that moment, all this stuff that I'd just been talking about just kind of like came back to me all at once. My search for knowledge throughout my whole life up until this point, my fascination with these fundamental unseen realities, falling in love with the truth and the way that the sacraments reveal the truth and map it out to us, and the way that they affect us in earth-shattering ways like the Eucharist at Mass. And it all of a sudden hit me, this is something that I could do, and this is something that I want to do. And that was my first experience of hearing the call. I'd like to think that it was all downhill from there, but it really wasn't. My path of accepting this call was, in a lot of ways, just as rocky as first coming to hear it. That's a story for another time. But what this story of tracing my pursuit of knowledge throughout my path, my vocation, tells me is that the truth is not just a goal. The truth is a person. And my calling is to help the people of God to know Him face to face. Thank you.